I've always been a contrarian, not just in my investment, but in all aspects of my life. I've always gone to places where the group has not gone, where the group has avoided. I've always tried to fill in gaps that I saw left by others. And that is the driving purpose of the discussion this morning, to fill the gap, to fill the hole. The purpose of being a contrarian is not to be disagreeable, but to try to make things whole. I am a lifelong environmentalist. I began this career before 1970, before the first Earth Day, because I saw this extraordinary living entity on television, as we saw last night, and I saw it being destroyed systematically around me in my little town of Sunnyvale, and I wanted to protect that jewel. I've also been a lifelong Republican for very similar reasons, because I love the interplay of the market, the interplay of engagement between people, the creative capacities of people to trade with one another what they are good at, respectively, and to come out with more at the end, that creative potential. I see no contradiction between my environmental self and my Republican self. In fact, I see them as parts that become whole when they're brought together. Both of these systems, the ecosystem and the economy, a system of feedback and adaptation where complementary opposites come together and create larger wholes, each of them with emergent qualities that are the basis of sustainability. In the work that my colleagues and I do at Future 500, where we hang our hats, we bring together complementary opposites of two particular kinds: major global corporations and passionate activist groups. We harness the oftentimes anger and passion of the activist groups and direct it toward resolving problems with the corporations. We combine the power of the corporations to impact markets and to impact politics with the passion and the purpose of the environmentalists and the social advocates to make life better for everyone. From those combinations, we have breakthrough achievements that could not have happened in any other way. Where we have managed to produce outcomes through this process, it's always been people in communities that were demonized by one side or the other that provide the connect that leads to the breakthrough. And many times this has been political conservatives. The intense division that I've grown up with in the environmental movement between corporations and activists is now spreading to politics. There is a degree of fear and hatred in politics that's greater than anything that I have seen in my lifetime. And I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of angry people. But the degree of division that I see today, that we all feel today, is greater than any of that. And I would like to suggest that there is an interest served by that division. And it's not an interest of any particular demon group that might be coming up in your mind, but it's a generalized interest of a status quo that tends to want to stay in power. A status quo of thousands of parts and pieces, corporations and labor and government agencies and contractors and military and all of these that wants to stay in power. And each one of these makes a choice to divide the public, because by dividing the public in half, it's impossible for a majority to come together for any kind of fundamental systemic change. And so while I do not believe there's any conspiracy afoot to divide us, I do believe that it happens to serve status quo interests very broadly and very temporarily to keep us divided. But the left and right ought not be divided. In the work that we've done, it has been social and religious conservatives that enabled us to bring Coca-Cola and Genocide Intervention Network together to help fight genocide in Sudan. It was fiscal conservatives and religious conservatives that enabled us to design the California bottle bill and to bring environmentalists and corporations and Republicans and Democrats together on that, the nation's leading recycling law. It was business conservatives in almost all cases that enabled us to bring together forest protection advocates and ocean protection advocates and major corporations to use their buying power to drive sustainable forestry. So it's always been those folks. But in my movement, the environmental movement, in the past few generations, we have rejected the conservation half of the environmental movement. The incredible tradition and heritage of folks on the right who are dedicated to protecting the environment, but bring to it a different worldview and a different point of view that doesn't perhaps fit always with the coastal ethic that tends to define the climate movement. And so we brought together two fine folks that I deeply respect here to have a discussion about this. What I'd like you to do is to really hear and feel what they say. Because I think if you hear and feel what they say, you'll embed that knowledge in your work and be able to be much more effective advocates. So, Debbie Dooley, one of the founders of the Tea Party, former director of Tea Party Patriots, founder of the Green Tea Party, now president of Conservatives for Energy Freedom, a strong proponent of solar energy, renewables, and so on, and we'll hear a little bit why she's entered into that fray. And Jerry Taylor, who I've known for decades now, founding president of Niskanen Center. Before that, he was 23 years with the Cato Institute, the libertarian group, where he frustrated and confounded many of us in the environmental community by being somewhat skeptical of the traditional government-centric norms of regulating and protecting the environment, being skeptical even of climate and climate change, but now filling that very important gap of folks from the free market community that are dedicated to solutions like a carbon tax. So let me start with you, Debbie, if I may. Welcome here.
It is a pleasure to be here. Hello, everybody.
Now, Debbie, you were a founder of the Tea Party. I want to know, what do these folks need to know about why it was that you felt you had to be a part of this Tea Party movement? And then the second question will be, how does the Tea Party and clean energy relate?
Well, I'm going to tell you some things you may be shocked with. The actual Tea Party movement did not actually begin under President Obama. There were many of us, such as myself, that were lifelong Republicans and activists that had major issues with the Bush administration. We opposed, we felt like they were just catering too much to a lot of the different things going on, and they were big government Republicans with No Child Left Behind. Then you had the Wall Street bailout, better known as TARP. That incensed many of us. We were upset at the Republican Party. We were upset at the Democrat Party. But we did not know what to call the movement until after President Obama took office and began bailouts after bailouts after bailouts, which we very strongly opposed. Then we heard Rick Santelli's rant on the Chicago trading floor. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, we need to form another Boston Tea Party. So we did. There were 22 of us that did this, but we were just as angry at the Republican Party as we were at the Democrat Party. I am a Christian conservative. My dad was a preacher. The Tea Party movement had a lot of libertarian-leaning values in it. And as a Tea Party conservative, I began to look at the environment. I actually had a major fight with Georgia Power over 2 nuclear reactors, and I began to investigate clean energy, and I said, hey, solar, this is within our Tea Party values because we support free market choice, competition choice, which rooftop solar clean energy provides, and we always supported fiscal responsibility, where it is a lot more fiscally responsible to prevent damage than it is to clean up the damage. And we all support and I think that's vitally important, and we support individual liberty and freedom. And so it would just be a natural fit for me and other Tea Party activists.
So in the Tea Party, the origins of the Tea Party, it sounds like, were partly a response to Wall Street, partly a response to the connections of government and corporations and that power base.
You're absolutely correct with that.
So why wasn't there a natural cohesion between, let's say, the Occupy movement, which had a similar objective, and Tea Party? Why were they cast against each other? Why did they feel a sense of animosity toward each other?
Well, I think one side felt the other side was actually, like we felt on the Tea Party movement that we did not believe corporations were bad or were evil. We just felt like they had too much power with our political process in Washington, D.C., which we fully believe that money controls Washington, D.C. And so, but we did not feel they were evil. And I actually worked and formed, I actually did something that was unique. I actually, in Georgia, my home state, on other issues, I sat down and I actually had a conversation with many people in the Occupy movement and with my friends on the left. And we found out, there's a lot of issues that we agree on if we would just have a respectful conversation and flesh out those issues.
So you saw in D.C. the problem being a government that was allied with various interest groups. The interest group corporations not being intrinsically evil, but having been corrupted by government in that case, or by the attraction of the money and power that they can access there.
Well, we believe that government was corrupted by the corporations and money, but that corporations were not inherently evil. They just took advantage of a process that's in place.
Now, Jerry Taylor, it takes a lot of courage, and I want people to realize how much courage it takes to be in the positions that both Debbie and Jerry are in their communities. Imagine what it would be like with you in a community of folks, many of whom consider you to be, the devil. It takes a lot of courage to do that. And you've been through some fires in your experience. With Cato Institute, when you were there, what is it that caused you to shift gradually on the issue of climate? From a position as a skeptic to one that I think believes fundamentally in the science?
Well, there were a few things. It wasn't any one particular event. First, I discovered that the scientific narratives I was trafficking in on television and in print broadcast. I mean, I was on Fox, I was in the National Review, I was on Laura Ingram's show. I mean, I was all over the right. And I slowly discovered that the scientific stories I was telling did not hold up. And the reason I discovered this was because I tried to argue with the best and brightest of the other side, which meant I had to seriously wrestle with their arguments. And when pressed to do the due diligence that all of us should do probably a bit more of, I found to my dismay that a lot of the scientific arguments were dodgy, cherry-picked, misrepresenting the positions of the other side, or were, some degree of either poor analysis or intentionally misleading, and that kind of shook me. And the more due diligence I did in the course of making these arguments, because I wanted to do a good job, the more I found that the scientific stories about how climate change wasn't happening or it was going to be very modest kind of fell apart. So then I moved to talk about the economic issues where I thought I was on firmer ground, say, all right, well, maybe climate change is more significant problem than I had realized or that people on the right think, but the fact is decarbonizing this economy, literally removing all fossil fuels from the economy by 2050 or 2060, which is what we have to do if we're going to hit the 2C target that has been embraced by the IPCC, is a really ambitious, expensive project. But I found over time that I could not find a single credentialed economist who writes on these topics in the peer-reviewed literature who would back my position. every single last one of them, including the more free market economists that I was working with, had all over time embraced carbon pricing, either through cap and trade or through a carbon tax. Not one of them embraced my arguments. Now, this is pretty hard. You're in a think tank. You're supposed to be forwarding academic expertise to make your points, and there's no academic expertise to forward. Yeah, sure, I could find the guy who's the head of the entrepreneurship project at Arkansas State University, the BB&T chair over there, who doesn't publish in the peer-reviewed literature and hands out Ayn Rand to his students, but I couldn't find anybody who really knew what they were talking about. And then a friend of mine wrote an article in a law review that caught my attention. He said, look, even if the skeptics are right and climate change is a pretty mild, will be a fairly modest event, it doesn't follow that we don't act. He said, look, as libertarians, we believe in protecting property rights. And if you're telling me, which is the standard conservative and libertarian narrative, that if Party A, people who are putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, are destroying the property of Party B, the rest of us, then if A profits more than B loses, it's A-okay. Now, when did libertarians believe that? Libertarians believe in protecting property rights, not with a proviso that says, unless somebody makes a hell of a lot of money blowing those property rights to smithereens. And that had a lot of, I had never thought of it quite that way, and I found out that people in my world didn't want, looked at that law review article and the conversation that followed the way that the Pope looked at Martin Luther several hundred years ago. This is just, you can't have that conversation. And then I guess the final straw was a friend of mine, Bob Litterman, who was a partner at Goldman Sachs at one point and who now is at Kepos Capital, came in to see me and he said, the problem with what you're arguing is that you're talking about what the most likely outcome from climate change is, and your story is it will probably be on the modest side. And maybe you're right, it's possible, but there's a large distribution of possible outcomes from climate change. Some of which are relatively modest, some of which are civilization threatening. And you have to consider the fact that any one of those scenarios can play out, and you have to price those risks. It doesn't matter what the most likely outcome is. You just look at Goldman Sachs, I deal with risks like this all the time. We don't know exactly what the chances are of different outcomes from different investment scenarios, but we can't ignore the fact that there's a distribution of risk here. And conservatives should be pricing that risk. It is not conservative to pretend those risks don't exist. And that was a pretty powerful argument to me. And so over the course of 23 years, my position moved from, pretty much where the Trump administration is at present, to a place now where I go to conferences like this and argue for climate action from a libertarian conservative perspective.
So you're here in an audience
that clearly celebrates your conversion and is happy that you have. But what is it that this audience, or let's say the progressive environmental movement overall, needs to know? Where are they wrong? Where are free market thinkers right? That can help them to find genuine common ground that can draw additional supporters from across the aisle.
Well, I think there's two things that are critical to keep in mind. First, messenger is more important than message in American politics, and in the course of having conversations with people who don't agree with you. The bottom line is no matter how good an Al Gore documentary is, nobody on the right's going to pay attention to it. No matter how good a Paul Krugman column might be, or no matter how powerful it is, nobody on the right's going to pay attention to it. Likewise, no matter how strong an argument from George Will is, nobody in the resist movement is going to pay attention to it unless he's throwing in their lot with them. So, and this is a universal. So if you want to be able to talk to conservatives and Republicans, you have to be able to speak their language. Russia. I joke a little bit about that.
Okay.
No, but the reality is that to talk to conservative and libertarian and Republican audiences, you need to be a Republican, conservative, or libertarian if you want to do it effectively, or at least that you have to be non-threatening. And that's just the reality of things. And it applies on the left as well. And the second thing is you have to make climate action and climate solutions congruent with their ideological priors. If you're asking them to give up the ghost on capitalism or big government or what have you, because of the more extreme scenarios that could play out in climate change, you're just not going to win that fight. So you have to make the argument in a fashion that can resonate. So, for instance, to argue that there are a lot of things we don't know about climate change. There are risks. Is it conservative to ignore risks? When was it conservative to play dice with the planet, play dice with the economy? In foreign policy, for instance, you might remember after 9/11, Dick Cheney said, when he was talking about nuclear weapons in Pakistan and how they might find their way to al-Qaeda, Dick Cheney said, if there's even a 1% chance that those nuclear weapons and that nuclear technology can find their way to Islamic terrorists, we have to treat it as a certainty as far as policy response. Boy, talk about a lusty commitment to the precautionary principle. Imagine if that story were told about climate change. There's even a 1% chance that the kind of cataclysmic outcomes from climate change could play out as some scientists fear. Do we have to take that, likewise, as a certainty as far as policy response? And if not, Mr. Conservative and Libertarian, why? These kind of arguments are the sort that are going to resonate, and it's important that the solution likewise harness things that conservatives and libertarians care about. Happily, we know what the best solution to climate change is to harness capitalism. You know, you take my word for it, Bernie Sanders believes that, Al Gore believes that, Sheldon Whitehouse believes that. Put a price on carbon and make sure that those price signals play out all throughout the economy, and then let market actors decide when, where, and how to reduce emissions. And there's a virtual universal consensus that this is the most effective policy to immediately reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a tangible fashion. There's no ideological divide on this issue, but a lot of people on the right think otherwise, because they'll see Naomi Klein's book at the End of Capitalism, and she'll say, you know, in that book, that climate change means capitalism's got to die. Or Bill McKibben will say we need a mobilization of government on the style of World War II to address climate change. That's going to scare hell out of conservatives and libertarians, and rightly so.
Those are the kinds of voices that conservatives often hear, just as progressives hear the most strident voices on the right, and it provokes them and ensures that they're going to keep watching MSNBC. But the folks on the right hear Naomi Klein, they hear Bill McKibben, and not the entire story, but the little snippets that talk about the end of capitalism as a necessary outcome of the need to protect climate. Debbie, when you're in communities of Tea Party folks and you're proposing clean energy, how are you treated by others in the Tea Party? Is it generally a welcome message where they understand that what you're trying to do is decentralize energy, or do you get a lot of negative feedback from them?
Well, I'm a lifelong conservative and a founding member of the Tea Party movement now, but when I began to research energy and find out that what I had been told for years, for decades, about renewables and about our climate were, many were outright lies and fallacies. Then I began to gather my facts, make sure I had everything together. And when I go and I talk to conservatives about energy, number one, I don't mention climate change. Mm-hmm. My dad was a retired Baptist minister, and he always told me, in order to get them in the church, mm-hmm. they have to hear your message. Mm-hmm. So when I go to conservative audiences, I talk about energy choice, energy freedom, mm-hmm. national security, mm-hmm. individual liberty, mm-hmm. and being good stewards of the environment God gave us. Yeah. Many of our Republican elected officials are also Christians, yet they implement policies that destroy God's creation. Mm-hmm. And when you talk about that and you lay the facts down and you make the statement, even though I don't mention climate change, mm-hmm. I mentioned the fact that man's damaging the environment and we need to do something about it because it will be too costly to clean it up. All of a sudden, you can see the little light bulbs go off. Yeah. And they're receptive to it. I don't make fossil fuel the bad guys. Mm-hmm. I make, the polluters. I make, just say, look, this is about freedom and choice, and we owe it to future generations of Americans. Mm-hmm. And I form coalitions with groups on the left, so it's not just Tea Party activists. Yeah. Many times a mistake is made by my friends on the progressive side of saying, well, this person is a Republican, they're a Trump supporter, they're Tea Party activists. They don't believe in climate change, so they're anti-clean energy. That is the biggest mistake you can make. It doesn't matter why someone supports clean energy. For me, it's a matter of the fact that they do support clean energy, and we can advance clean energy policies. I've had a very good success rate in doing that in states like Florida, Georgia, and some of the other southeastern states.
So there is general agreement, folks, in the political
Yes.
community, the Tea Party community, that humanity is having a damaging effect on the global ecosystem.
Right.
They may not call it climate change. That may be a political hot button for them, but they can certainly see that the planet is being
Yes.
damaged by the collective impact, that it's God's earth that is being violated through those actions. And they can support and get enthusiastic about clean energy as well. Where do today's advocates make their mistakes? And choose anywhere across. What are we doing wrong that as a consequence of which we are failing, I think, to draw in the conservative support that we need for this movement? What are we doing wrong?
Well, you make it about climate change instead of being good stewards of the environment. Gave
So
us
stewards of the environment is key.
right, that we have to do it for us, for our children's health.
Yeah.
You talk about clean air and clean water, because a big portion of the Republican base and conservative base or sportsmen, they have hunted and fishing, they want clean air and clean water.
Yeah.
You make it about choice and individual liberty.
Yeah.
And national security. There is nothing more centralized in our nation than our power grid. It's more vulnerable to a terrorist attack. When moving to decentralized energy like rooftop solar and some of these others,
Right.
then all of a sudden it helps keep us safe. So those are winning messages. Free
and that's
market.
interesting, because it's the independent, it's having your own energy that's as much a motivator, it sounds like,
Yes.
for solar and wind as it is to be doing it green. That if there were a giant utility providing solar for everyone, that wouldn't be as attractive as rooftop solar, having your own energy supply, being independent in the event that problems happen, you've got your own energy right there that you're in control of.
Absolutely, that's you. I mean, that's your energy. I would love to see investment so we can do some of the things like they're doing in Germany, where a lot of the newer homes are being built completely disconnected from the grid, using a combination of natural gas and solar.
Yeah.
Imagine how much there would be a reduction in the carbon footprint if homes started generating their own electricity using solar. There would be no need to build these expensive nuclear plants or these big, huge plants. And I just believe in free market solutions to solve our climate problem.
Right. Now, you also talk about sportsmen and hunters,
Yes.
fishers, and so on. I'm not naturally attracted to hunting. I just eat animals
Right.
after someone else has done the dirty work. But what is it about, in the environment, coming from San Francisco, it certainly
Right.
makes a difference. But we seem to think that the hunting and sportsman crowd, that the fishers crowd, is a foreign race that is not really part of the environmental movement, because we love animals, except during lunch. And in fact, we love them even more, perhaps, during lunch. How do we make it okay to bring in the millions of members of the National Rifle Association who are in it because they're hunters, because they love nature, they want to go out and kill things there?
Well, I'm actually, I'm actually doing that. And trust me, if you were from the South, you would be a hunter or fisherman, because, you grew up doing that.
Yeah.
But they want the animals healthy. They want clean water. They want clean air.
Yeah.
And the Republican Party has a history of conservationists. If you go back to Teddy Roosevelt, he was an avid hunter and fisherman. He was a big conservationist. Richard Nixon actually created the EPA. And I think it is extremely unfortunate that at one time both sides were coming together and saying, we've got to protect this environment. The earth belongs to all of us. It's not just Democrats, it's not just Republicans. We all have an equal responsibility. And it's unfortunate that special interests, big money, have put a lot of information out that was absolutely false.
Yeah.
And they've influenced the dialogue, so if you're conservationist now, you're going to be primaried and you're going to be attacked. And I think it's unfortunate that this has happened.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Jerry, you've been in the center of this with folks in the Beltway, and I think, and I don't know what stories you can tell, want to tell, but I know it's been challenging to be a climate advocate in that community. How is it that that climate first, and now I think more broadly the environment, has become not a bipartisan issue where conservatives and conservation are seen as being on the same page, but a bitter partisan issue where a Republican who expresses, we had a group called Republicans for Environmental Protection, they had to change their name because they had environment in it, so that it wouldn't be too democratic sounding. How is it that this happened, and why is it, from my perspective, getting even worse now?
Well, Debbie and I work in different slipstreams. Not that one is less important than the other, but they're different. Debbie's working grassroots, and the Niskanen Center, which I direct, is relentlessly focused on Capitol Hill. So our main audience are elected members of Congress, Senate, their senior staff, committee staff, and the important political actors that they listen to. So we are relentlessly focused on Washington, not on the grassroots. That's what Debbie does. So I have a little bit different audience.
Yeah.
To give you a little bit of a lay of the land, there are probably, on the climate front anyway, 40 to 60 Republicans in the House and 10 to 12 Republicans in the Senate who are deeply uncomfortable with the orthodox position in the party of climate denialism. They would like to see a Republican response to climate change that is meaningful. They're not entirely sure what that response ought to look like, and there's no window of opportunity right now to forward it. But there is material for us to work with, and those are the folks that I spend a lot of time with, trying to bring them together and unify them on what a policy might look like, and then to work with them to look for windows of opportunity to advance it, and then to try to add numbers to their ranks as well. The reason this is so difficult, the reason why those numbers, while it might surprise you they're as large as they are a long shot from being a majority of the Republicans in Congress, that's certainly clear, is that being hostile to environmental protection is largely a matter of tribal identity right now in the Republican Party. It's how you show that you're part of Team Trump, that you think, and the reason why is nothing that's particularly unique to conservatives or Republicans, but sometimes we kind of acknowledge this there. We don't really fully appreciate how important it is. Most people sort out whether to support a candidate or oppose a candidate, or support a policy argument or to reject a policy argument based on the intentions heuristic. The person who's for it, what are their intentions? So if you think Donald Trump really wants to make America great again, you're going to generally incline to support his policies because you think, well, okay, he's got the right intentions. He wants to bring America back into this better time. And so, I support him. That may strike you as silly because intentions don't necessarily translate into positive outcomes, and those intentions may be not, they may be superficial and they're there to trick you or something like that. But that's how most people sort these things out. So on the right, the reason, for instance, why a lot of conservatives and libertarians reject a lot of climate science is not because they're stupid. It's not because their IQs aren't there, and it's not because they haven't read enough. The reason why is that they are not wrong to think that most climate scientists, most people in academia, most of the even economists that I reference, in the peer-reviewed literature, they're liberals, they're Democrats, they're not Republicans. They believe in things that they don't believe. And therefore, to a Republican or libertarian mind, their intentions are bad. They want to grow government. They want to, constrain capitalism. They want to limit individual liberty. They want to go dance with wolves and return to some, pastoral, pre-industrial civilization. And when you believe that those intentions are in play, you're going to harness all of the motivated cognition you've got, all the IQ points you've got, every bit of reasoning power to convince yourself why that has to be rejected. And that's the fundamental problem that we have.
So we have, Debbie, clean energy, Tea Party. Is there a majority of folks within the Tea Party that are accepting of clean energy despite the tribal impulse to be one with President Trump or be one with your party?
There is. I can tell you I had in Georgia, the reddest of red states, I got involved in solar, and I changed the conversation on solar in 2013. Prior to that, you know, people said, oh, solar's only something tree huggers like, or hippie-wearing, hippie sandal-wearing folks. And, I mean, that was not true. So I got engaged, and all of a sudden, people say, oh, she's a tree hugger. You know, she's a liberal. And people that knew me laughed out loud when they say that. They try to say, use identity, tribal politics by saying with me, all of a sudden, hey, you know, she's in this tribe. She's not in our tribe anymore. But I quickly disputed that. Yeah. But Republicans in Georgia, there was, because of the conversation and talking points using free market, the Georgia legislature passed a power purchase agreement bill a few years ago that would allow PPA, that would allow power purchase agreement for rooftop solar in Georgia. It was championed by Republicans. It was gone through the Georgia legislature by Republicans, and it's probably the only bill that got 100% support based on free market. In Florida, I helped put together a coalition that included progressives, environmentalists, Christian Coalition, Tea Party Network, business groups, Republican Liberty Caucus, Libertarian Party of Florida, to support a moving solar based on free market choice and competition. We've been successful doing that. It posed very well. After the election, I was a Trump supporter. I know people in this room probably think that, oh, I cannot believe she did that, but, you know. But Trump supporters don't necessarily always go along with what Donald Trump says. There was a poll taken after the election by a Republican polling firm about clean energy, and it found that 75% of Trump supporters supported more to advance renewables in our country. 75% of Trump supporters. NASCAR is really big in the South, in the Southeast. And NASCAR surveyed their fans 3 years ago. I think it was like 80% of NASCAR fans had a very favorable view of clean energy and solar. Again, it's all about the message and solutions. With our environmentalist friends, with people on the left, their solution is more government intervention and regulation. Regulation on the Republican side is free market choice, individual liberty, and things like that. And I think when you talk about free market choice and competition, that's where you will win Republicans. I went to West Virginia a few months ago, coal country. I met one-on-one with Republican elected officials in the legislature. It was about one of their electric monopolies plans to bring a coal plant that was in a free market situation in Ohio and bring it into the rate base in West Virginia. They opposed that. I talked to them one-on-one. They had problems with these giant electric monopolies. They support solar choice. They supported individual liberty. And so it's all about the message with the right messenger.
And I think at one point that I want to make is the cultural difference between the left and the right. You talked about, you know, the reaction to hippie sandal-wearing folks. I remember when the Tea Party was active and Occupy was active at the same time, and on my Facebook page there would be these, arguments between advocates of each. And the Tea Partiers would say, well, at our events we're very clean and we're very orderly and we clean up the litter afterwards. And at your events, these Occupy movements, it's a mess and people are hanging around. And it was more the cultural difference than the fact that, hey, we're both upset at Wall Street for having excess political power and for this combination. And I've come to understand that the world is naturally, for some reason or other, genetic, biological, experiential, about half of us are conservative in nature, about half of us are on the progressive side in nature. And what they teach in Poli-Sci 1A is true. Conservatives tend to see people as fundamentally having a selfishness problem, right. And they see nature or the surrounding environment as fundamentally having threats. And so if you look at the world that way, you're going to think, hey, I like things that are going to discipline those selfish people to be a little bit more caring about others. And so I like ministers who come down hard on people for sins. I like police who keep things orderly. I like soldiers who keep our country free from external threats. I like corporations in a free market system so that our selfishness drives benefits on both sides of the transaction. Those things are good because people are selfish, and I want to protect for that. On the progressive side, there is the belief that people are fundamentally selfless, and that if they simply are released from these constraints imposed upon them by judgmental ministers, overbearing police, militaristic soldiers, and corporations that drive selfishness, if it weren't for those controls, people would be good and they would be doing good for one another. And the magic of having those two ideas working in tandem is that then we are safe and free. We have a society that keeps us safe to the extent that we need to, but also continually liberates more and more people that are oppressed. How can we, in our current political system, where it is harder for a progressive to engage with a conservative than it is for, I don't know, what's a good analogy? I mean, we will not sit down. In this audience, I would suspect 95% of folks would identify themselves as liberal, progressive, or at least center-left. Why is that? How can we create a cultural marriage that can bring the 70% majority that supports action on climate together and make them a cohesive political force?
Well, I think compromises and coalitions under the current state of affairs are going to be less split the difference operations than they are transpartisan operations. In other words, you need to convince Republicans and Libertarians to embrace policies because they're consistent with their own ideological priors and for their own ideological reasons, without requiring them to give up the ghost on anything in particular about their worldviews. But it turns out there's a lot of common ground that can be found on the hard left and the hard right on some of these issues. You can see it play out. An example of this playing out is on criminal justice reform. Here we have a world in which, the great Satan on the right, Charles Koch, is working with the ACLU and Black Lives Matter to help forward a positive agenda on criminal justice. Now, how did that happen? Did somebody just beat Charles up heavily for a couple of weeks? Put spotlights on him and sodium pentothal in a basement and brainwash him? No. I mean, it turns out that a lot of libertarians have a real problem with militarism in the police as well, and with the current criminal justice system. And you can find more cases for transpartisan alliances than you might think. But the idea, and one of the things that's interesting to me, coming from my Cato background now into the world I'm in, is I traffic much more greatly with progressives than I ever used to. And I think that on the left there is this cute and friendly and thoroughly naive and wrong idea that if people of goodwill who are interested in public policy would just sit down with one another and talk things through them. By God, a lot of these artificial anger issues and political positions and beliefs would just kind of fall apart, and we would eventually find ourselves after an hour of goodwill singing Kumbaya and joining hands and agreeing on this, that, or the public. No, that's just not true. Because there are real fundamental differences about where people think public policy ought to go and what values are more important than other values. So libertarians and conservatives will say individual liberty and freedom, or at least rhetorically, is more important than anything else. And people on the left are going to say, well, no, actually, we think equality and equal opportunity is more important than that. Some of you probably don't, but the point is these are kind of broad brush statements, but they're pretty true. I mean, these value allegiances are very real. And they're largely what get in play here when we're talking about public policy.
What we've found is that, even though there are these too many, but different ways of looking at the world, that 70% of folks can come to agreement with one another, compromising and integrating their ideas on almost any issue, and certainly on climate. It's not a stretch. And yet we have a political system that instead of allowing the 70% in the middle to come to terms where you have freedom and equality in the right combination, you have an extreme right that defines the narrative in which you have to have a particular position on all of the wedge issues: abortion, guns, immigration, and climate. And on the left, you have to have the opposite position on all four of those issues.
Your point's well taken. In political science, this is pretty well investigated. The reality is that, and this may seem a little off topic, but it's not. It's exactly the point that you're making, Bill. Most people have an abysmal level of understanding of politics and policy. Mm-hmm. You might think you understand how little most people know or care about politics or policy. I guarantee you're overstating it by a factor of 10. Mm. Most people look at politics the way I look at European soccer. I know there's a league out there. I know there's Real Madrid and Manchester United. I know every 4 years there's a World Cup. That's about all I can tell you. Then I know that they wear advertising on their jerseys like they're NASCAR drivers. And that's it. That's all I know. That's all I care to know. Can't make me care. Well, that's the way 80% of the American public is about politics. Mm-hmm. Because of that, their opinions are extremely lightly held. They're not really based on anything. When you see polls about people say this or that about the Clean Power Plan, oh, come on. No more than 1 out of 100 of them knows what the hell the Clean Power Plan is, and yet they've got an opinion. 40-odd% of the American public seriously has an opinion about banning Agrabah, which is a make-believe country from a Disney movie. That actually was a poll. So in a world in which the vast majority of people could not care less about politics, know absolutely nothing of meaning with regards to policy, but they're compelled to have an opinion because they go out and they vote, and if you ask them a question, they'll give you an answer because you asked them. Yeah. That means that the 10 or 20% that really care, the NRA members, the members of Greenpeace, the members of Tea Parties or Occupy or the Resist Movement or Indivisible, these guys have massively outsized influence because politicians have to care about them. The 80%, you can move around easy. Donald Trump went into the Republican Party and sounded like Michael Moore as far as the war in Iraq, and he didn't matter. The party just went with him. But the people who really care, they have massively outsized influence. So, for instance, the NRA, their positions on guns are anathema in every single poll you'll ever see, right? It's such a minority. Like 70, 80% of the American public thinks the NRA is nuts. It doesn't matter because they don't know or care enough about politics to really act on it very much. But NRA members, they do care. So they have a lot of influence in American politics. And so that's why when you're talking about the vast majority of the public that says, they respond in public opinion polls on climate change in a reasonable fashion, all that, it's all well and good. It's good to know. It's a useful political talking point. I use it on the Hill too. But you know what? It's not that important. What really is important are the minority views out there, the well-organized constituencies that drive both the left and the right.
And I will say one thing about working together. I've been very successful doing that. You have to have a mutual respect, and you have to understand and be respectful of each other's differences and not mention them. And that's something vitally important. We are in a David versus Goliath battle. We have to think outside the box. And we need to have this discussion. We need to come together, but understand that, for example, I'm a Trump supporter. I went to Berkeley in February, had a very great reception. I love the folks there. They were shocked at what I said, but we had a mutual respect. They knew where I was coming from. I knew where they was coming from. But you know what? I respect your differences, and we have to come together. Earth and future generations depend upon us to protect the earth. This is a battle we cannot lose, and it's vitally important that we protect God's creation and not trash it. And that's something. And it's going to take both sides coming together to accomplish this using a message we both agree on.
And with that, I want to invite people to participate in a process to actually do that. We have a tremendous ally in a man named Trammell S. Crow. The
Yep.
name may be familiar. He's
I know Trammell.
land developer and so on. He is a Republican, major contributor to Republican politics. He is an environmentalist, major contributor to environmental action. He has been trying to bring the sides together. He will be convening folks from the right and the left this next April 20th to 22nd. Please write that down. This is in Dallas, Texas. This happens to be Earth Day weekend. There are other things happening the 18th through the 22nd, so take the whole week. But believe me, come to Dallas. Come to Middle America. Come to a place where conservative hunters, sportsmen, fishers can come together with, coastal green hippie sandal wearing, enviros, and actually share their cultural perspectives and come together with actual solutions. So write that down, April 20th through 22nd in Dallas, and let any of us know at Future 500 if you're interested in coming. This is not there's no registration fee. Trammell picks up the costs for it because he wants to bring people together to actually make a change. And we'll definitely have both of you there. I want to thank everyone for participating in this discussion. Encourage you to step across the cultural divide whenever we think that our opponents are unified, that the groups opposing us are all internally unified and monolithic in their opposition. We are missing half of our movement. Let's bring in the other half of our movement to protect the planet. Thank you very much.
Thank you.